Hello and welcome to Representation, Voice and Agency, the final event in the Stories We Tell Ourselves series, presented by the Wheeler Centre, Spread the Word and the Melbourne City of Literature Office. The series is supported by the UK-Australia Season Patrons Board, the British Council and the Australian Government as part of the UK-Australia Season. My name is Joy Francis. I'm Executive Director of Words of Colour Productions based in London, England, and I have the pleasure of being your host today. Despite it being the 21st century, we are here once again to explore and reinforce the obvious, that representation matters in literature, the importance and power of publishing marginalised others, intersectional and Indigenous voices that reflect the reality of the world we share, and the value of facilitating and creating platforms for writers of colour to exercise their agency, ownership of their craft, their stories and their narratives. To discuss this topic, we have some impactful, transformative and passionate independent publishers and literary agents from Australia and the UK. First of all, I'd like to welcome Crystal Mahey-Morgan, who is the founder of Own It, a multimedia storytelling lifestyle brand straddling books, music, art and film, dedicated to shining a light on stories that are often pushed into the shadows by predominantly white, middle-class-led industries, which she runs with creative director Jason Morgan. As well as being a publisher, Crystal is a literary, film and TV agent. Next up is Rachel bin Salah, whose passion for Indigenous people telling their own stories inspired her publishing career at Magabala Books in the 1990s, sorry, I'm aging you, Rachel. In 1940, Rachel became Magabala's publishing director, and in 2018, she wrote her first book, Alfred's War, a poignant account of the contribution made by Indigenous servicemen. Grace Heifetz began working at Curtis Brown, where she worked in a number of roles until mid-2019. And in July 2019, she joined forces with fellow literary agents Gabby Neha to create Left Bank Literary, where she represents clients such as Emily Maguire and Chris Hammer. And finally, we're joined by Nell Andrew, who joined Rachel Mills Literary in 2020. She previously worked as an agent at Peters, Fraser and Dunlop for 11 years, and prior to that at Macmillan Publishers. Nell represents an array of internationally best-selling and award-winning authors across both fiction and non-fiction, such as Sarah Collins, Jingjing Lee, and Beth Underdown. Nell was named Literary Agent of the Year 2021 at the Nibbies, which is the British Book Awards, and also became a published author in her own right under the name of Nell Davey. Welcome to you all.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi. Crystal, I want to start with you. I know you, I'm well aware of your work and just how you've been changing the game, really, as far as I'm concerned. I mean, you're more than just a publisher. I mean, you straddle TV and film and music. Why this approach?
Hi, it's so good to be here, guys. Why this approach? So Own It, we describe ourselves as a storytelling lifestyle brand, the idea being it's stories first. So start with IP, start with stories, and then think about the best way to have those stories reach an audience and communicate those stories. And often that works across different formats. So when we started, it was really about, I came from mainstream publishing. So I worked at PFD Literary Agency like Nell, and then at Penguin Random House, and everything felt very siloed. It felt very traditional. It felt very static. And it felt that as a result of that, we was missing out on great talent and great content creators, but also missing out on speaking to different types of audiences. And I've always felt that there's a huge readership that the industry just isn't tapping into and isn't servicing. And so I guess the different approach really came from thinking about audience as well. There's audiences who will spend a lot lot of money on music or games or apps or films or all sorts of entertainment, but maybe not spend that money on books, maybe not engage in books and feel like books are for them. So really, it came from wanting to have a storytelling approach, and to speak to audiences in the way I think that they now kind of engage with content, which is very multimedia. So yeah, I guess we started the literary agency, film and TV agency, because it just felt like there was a gap in the market for people who really understood the industry, the business terms, the business end and commercial end of the industry, but then also creatively understood different voices and how they could be positioned to find different audiences. So it was a very organic thing. Our first client was Courtney Newland, who's like really a legend in terms of Black British publishing, but just British publishing generally. We then signed Selena Godden, and from there the agency just kind of took off and evolved. And so yeah, the whole process with Own It has been very organic. It started with a frustration of the industry, and it's kind of led us to where we are now, which is exciting.
I mean, Crystal, you said, you know, I've always had a desire to see what isn't being represented, and to change that somehow. And often what isn't being represented is me, whether that's being a woman, working class, being British Asian. You know, how have you responded to that, and how do you feel about that now? Because, you know, another sort of narrative that is predominant is that we don't read. People of colour, particular constituencies and communities don't read books.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of my frustration came through sitting in acquisitions meetings and understanding how, you know, the majority of the industry, so in that microcosm, the sales team, the marketing team, the publicity team, the editorial team, really viewed certain content creators, writers, voices, and audiences. And, you know, there's so many things, whether it's race or it's class, or there's just so many misconceptions about people who write and people who read. And like I say, I'm a writer initially, in that I started off as a freelance writer. I used to write for The Guardian when I was 16, The Face magazine, you know, so to me, the idea that only certain people write from a very young age was always a myth. And I've always loved books. And, you know, you start with yourself, and you start with, well, if I am in this picture and I am part of this kind of group of people who like reading or like writing, why are all of these assumptions being made? I'm not sure how different things are, honestly speaking, to say the 10, 15 years that I've been in the industry from when things started. I think we're speaking about things more, and I think we're more aware of things, and I think there's lots of schemes and there's lots of things to try to tackle it, but that doesn't necessarily mean the changes are happening behind the scenes where they really matter. Sometimes it all feels very performative and it's on stage and everyone's shouting loudly. But as an agent, for example, I'm still seeing how authors are being dealt with, the perceptions around them, the myths around them, across the board, you know, whether that's Waterstones and them going and signing their books, or whether that's kind of at acquisition stage and people perceiving them as authors there. So I just think we have a long way to go, but that change will happen by more people who aren't traditional industry people, such as myself, kind of being within the industry and seeing growth in the things that we do.
Thanks, Crystal. I want to bring you in here, Rachel. You know, you're a publisher as well, and you know, you've asserted that if you're not represented in a national narrative, then you're not part of the narrative. And I would imagine that, and I could see different heads nodding while Crystal was talking. How is Magabala Books countering that inequitable reality in Australia?
So Magabala's been going now for about 30 years on and off. So roughly in about 1984, it was established. And it was established because Australian Aboriginal people are probably one of the most studied races on the face of the earth. Any of their cultural content, IP, any of their knowledge, traditional stories, once, as you know, with copyright, once it's written down, you don't necessarily own it, even though culturally you do. So one of the reasons Magabala came about was because cultural IP was continually being taken away from individuals and community, and lots of people making money off somebody else's labour in that sense. So Magabala came into being from, well, its genesis was in that. Magabala really was a grassroots movement for equity in lots of different ways. And like over the years, probably in the last 5 years, has there been any money, in a sense, to be made out of First Nations publishing or publishing with people of colour in that sense? And the only reason, I'm just going to throw lots of ideas around, the only reason in Australia that it's come to the forefront is mainly because First Nations or minority groups in terms of history is now part of the Australian curriculum. So it's embedded in our learning now, therefore there's money in it, in the sense that people are wanting the resources for it. So, for the bigger conglomerates, in a sense, it's a good business decision in that way. So, with the rise of social media, and all the class differences, the people that have not had access to a platform or a voice now have a platform and a voice. But on the downside of that, those that have had the platform, we are now seeing a rise in lots of different ways with racism and fascism, in regards to the other in that way. Look, I'm a Nimbunbura Aboriginal woman, Nimbunbura Yarra woman from Broome in Western Australia. My father is a Malaysian Aboriginal man, and my mother is an immigrant from the Catholic estates in Northern Ireland. And when I went over to Northern Ireland, the first thing they said to me, I was 19, was, "Oh, you're an Australian." And I sat there and I was like, get fucked. I'm not Australian. Because my history is not in the national narrative. You all watch Summer Bay. You all know that there ain't no dark-skinned people that exist in that program. And if they do, it's usually for 4 or 5 weeks. Do you know what I mean? It's these faces, these stories are not inherent anyway, and they're not represented anywhere. So that was a shock to me, that I had never considered myself Australian. And then I accidentally got into publishing. And, it was never on my radar. So I somehow ended up here and hung around like a bad smell. And, and since I've spent probably roughly on and off 30 years in and around Magabala Books. I came when I was 19 and now I'm 49. So, it's been a long, wild ride. And to see the genesis of minority voices, or what do we want to call it, diverse voices, the platforms that are available now. And especially me as an Aboriginal person, to work at a publishing house in the town that I grew up in, when not only was my family and myself quantified blood in terms of our whiteness, but also quantified in our blood by our Asianness. So, there's, not only there's a black-white ratio, there's a black-Asian ratio to where you sit in that whole thing as well. And, and my grandfather was one of the last hard hat pearl divers in an industry that when Australia was only letting, the White Australia policy. So, to not even be considered a citizen in your own country, is part of the reason why I do what I do. And when I was growing up, lots of Irish books from my mum, lots of Irish stories, lots of language from my Aboriginal grandmother, but only one Aboriginal book that I grew up with. Do you know what I mean? And so for me to sit in this space, I'm here to facilitate a platform, and that platform is for First Nations or people, diverse voices, to be able to be who they want to be without the structures of the industry telling them, oh no, we're only interested in trauma porn. We only want to know, that the stereotypes of victims. We only want to know about the educational aspect of who you are, rather than allowing the creator to be. So the platform that we give is you can be whoever you want to be in that sense. And as a publishing house, a First Nations Black publishing house, I don't dictate to you what you are and who you be or what genre you should be in. And the thing with people from diverse backgrounds is, we all talk about the gender binary, but people from minority backgrounds or don't have a voice, they are multidisciplinarians, but also they write across genres. So the non-genre binary applies to all of them in a sense, So, and, to, challenge all those stereotypes in all those genres as well. Anyway, I'm dribbling, I'll leave you to it.
No, I mean, it's funny because you've answered about 3 of the questions I have down for you later on, but I want to come back to that whole, because you can't, it's not linear, it's so multifaceted. So you can't talk about one without the other. And you're constantly unpicking because what we're talking about is constantly being, reduced, and minimized. So we have to then unpick it and allow it to breathe. So, completely hear you. And I want to come back to your point, actually, later on around the multidisciplinary activist element of this work that seems to be just inevitable, really. But thank you, Rachel. I want to come to Grace. I'll look at the literary, being a literary agent. And Grace, I mean, you left Curtis Brown to set up Sydney-based Left Bank Literary, specialising in fiction, quality fiction and non-fiction. I mean, did any of what I say at the beginning, and particularly in terms of what's been said so far, play a part in your decision to branch out on your own?
Yeah, I mean, I've been working in and around the arts, my whole career. It was, I guess I started agenting, and I guess, I was the assistant to the MD at Curtis Brown for a long time. And I just started to see, well, not started to, knew it my entire life, but saw there was a giant chasm of a hole for people that look like me and are diverse that just don't have that space. And I do feel like Australia is particularly behind. I mean, I think we all are collectively, but Australia is still very behind in sort of championing. And I only really feel like, yeah, like Rachel said, like in the last 5, 6, 7 years, that is really starting to shift. And I felt for a long time, these are the stories I wanted to read. These are the stories that I was interested in. And as Rachel said, when I was growing up, I would be asked by taxi drivers and people, they're like, oh yeah, where are you from? And I would say I'm Australian. They're like, yeah, but where are you from? And I said, well, 5th generation Chinese, 3rd generation Italian. Actually, my Anglo side is 1st generation. So, and just this misunderstanding that, that we kind of had to deal with. I mean, way before me and my mother and, but I think I started to see that I wanted to sort of help, I don't know, sort of bring up and do what I could do. So selfishly, so these books were published so I could read them. I mean, it was totally selfish, I have to say. And I just saw that there was a gap, and it was starting, it has felt for a long time, and I still feel it feels like this, that it's a community service. And we should be all patting ourselves on the back that we are supporting diversity. And really, at this point, I think it's a business. I mean, there is an audience. There are people that want to read these stories. There are people that look like me, look like all of us, that are desperate to read their stories and see their place and where they are in this space. And, I think I felt I was really lucky, because as soon as I started agenting, a lot of people wanted to be represented by someone that wasn't white. So, and obviously that's what I was passionate about. So, I mean, I felt like I sort of won the lottery in so many ways, because I was suddenly, able to represent and champion these incredible voices that have just, you know, I mean, just go on and are best-selling authors now and playwrights and directors. And, you know, so it just goes to show that there is a hunger for it. And yes, we have so far to go, particularly in publishing. I think one of the issues is that a lot of publishing houses want to publish diverse authors, but then they come into the publishing house and it's a whitewash. So I think that is one of like these next hurdles. And I know Rachel does a lot of work for that. I've sort of helped spearhead an internship to try and move that forward. And there's a lot of different initiatives happening. But until we start actually seeing that this is a business and this is actually advantageous to publishers to publish these books, because there is a market and people that I guess look like us need to have own this space.
I was going to say something else, but I definitely want to bring Nell in at this point now. And it's interesting, you know, going back to, just before I ask the question, going back to you having a conversation with the taxi driver, or not conversation, the question, the fact that everywhere we go, you get in a cab, you want to relax, and then it's like the Inquisition. But I always find it interesting that you have an industry that asks questions around diversity, and then you have random members of the public that ask you about where you're from, I call it, you know, but yet not respecting the answer, because if the answer was respected, we would not have to keep being asked the question. I just popped into my head. But I mean, you received your, you know, the Nibby last year, you know, for Literary Agent of the Year. And you said, you know, in your acceptance speech, sounds like the Oscars there, isn't it? That you had entered the industry that was predominantly for the people who did not look like me. And I always felt slightly out of place. And also the fact you believed you were, you know, even then you had to speculate. I think I'm the first, you know, literary agent of colour to win this award. I mean, how have you navigated this landscape? Because I know there's very few, because I remember when it was Susan Yearwood, who was the only Black literary agent, you know, back in like the early noughties. But how have you navigated this landscape? And what are some of the barriers that you've come across as an agent that you find concerning? We are going to look on the positive side shortly, but in terms of some of the constructive things that are happening. But I just think, it's just get a sense in each country and from your perspective, what's happening.
I think growing up as a person of colour in the 80s and the 90s, when, you know, which was challenging for lots of different reasons, you learn to code switch, which is, there's a version of you that exists at home and there's a version of you that exists outside. And the way that you behave and the language that you use and the accents that you use and the cultural references that you touch upon. And I think what I realized when I entered publishing was that I would have to code switch, that it didn't feel for a very long time as if there was a place for me to be my authentic self. So my hair was straight. I speak the way that I do because I got an assisted place to a very good school, but, you know, I didn't allow some of the less finessed elements come through in terms of my voice. And so they would always be like kind of surprised, I guess, when I actually rocked up, because the version that they had sort of seen and ascribed to didn't quite match the version that sort of arrived. And I think it's the difference between assimilation and acclimation. I feel like assimilation is where you neuter yourself and dilute yourself down to become an acceptable face of the version that you present. Whereas acclimation is, okay, so this is the environment that I'm in, and I'm gonna, you know, take on board that intel, but there's still space for you to exist. And I think my progression in publishing has moved from a space of assimilation to, as I've gotten more successful and grown more confident within my own skin, a place of acclimation. But it felt for a long time as if I needed to receive external permission for those things to be. Like, they just, you know, as I think I remember saying, there were no Black people when I was around in publishing. Like, the only Black people were people in IT. They just weren't people in the decision-making processes at all. background. And so it was a white version lens through which everyone else was seen. And there was no intel from those cultures coming through. And I think a lot of it was biting your tongue and processing it down. And it was a little bit like that scene in The Sunken Place in Get Out. You're just kind of like, I'm just going to have to retreat into myself because I can't. But I remember actually going to, this is when the first time when I sort of felt like I was able to really kind of just say what I wanted to say and sort of be down to the consequences. And it was actually, I think it was something that someone said earlier on in this chat. I went to like a diversity board panel thing that they were doing in publishing. It was like a kind of like quorum. Lots of people from sort of different agencies and different elements were being put together by like a major publisher. And they were talking about like, how do we grow more diversity within the industry? How do we reach more diverse readership? And one of the questions was, is it because people from a diverse background just don't read? They don't read as much. And I actually put my hand up and I went, that's such an offensive thing to say. I said, we're not illiterate. I come from, my people come from the West Indies as well as from the UK and a diaspora of various other places. But I said, you know, I'm from Grenada. We have a rich, brilliant, fertile rhetoric, and we have our own mythology and our own sort of literary background. We read like voraciously and as much as anybody else. I said, what you see is a tail off because there comes a point where you're just like, my experiences, my version of the world is not being represented in any way, shape and form. So we look somewhere else. I said, how can you turn around and say that we don't read? I said, like, look at Toni Morrison and Alice Walker and Ben Okri and Zora Neale Hurston. And I was like, and you know, like Langston Hughes, how can you possibly think that we don't read? We have our own canon. I said, is this really what you guys believe is the problem? The problem is us, not you. And they were sort of a bit taken aback. And I was like, I just don't believe that if you asked any other kind of subset or was looking at anything else, that you would be like, oh, it's because they don't read. I was like, fundamentally, it's such an offensive kind of viewpoint. And then from that point on, I was just like, fuck it, I just can't be asked. I'm going to just do what I want to do. And I'm going to say what I kind of want to say. And it had definitely been interesting though, because there were books that I really struggled to place at the beginning of my career that I know would not have been a problem now. And I find, I talked to the authors about it actually, and we sort of laugh a little bit because they were like, oh God, I'm in vogue now. And I was like, you're always in vogue. Like talent will always run out. But they were really, it was a real struggle. Like people like, there's no place this, like I can't see the readership. Now it's like people would snap my hands off for this. And we did eventually find publishers, and they did eventually find either critical commercial success. But I think it's this notion in publishing that of telling you what you want or telling you who you are, as opposed to listening and asking, okay, what do readers want? What is going on in this culture? What is interesting there? Like trying to be more kind of explorative rather than didactic. And we miss out a lot because of it. But you know, when I was starting, Irish literature was considered exotic. Irish literature was considered problematic. You know, it's been fascinating kind of watching things like Sally Rooney and Nisha Dolan and other kind of Irish writers sort of come through and really reclaim that, because for a long time that was considered, that could only be done in a sort of a traumatic way. It was like, you know, Frank McCourt and Angela's Ashes, it was potato famine, it was like nunneries. It's the notion that you could, and I say this because I lived in Ireland and I studied in Ireland for a time, the notion that you could exist outside the lens of sort of English patriarchy, that there was a whole culture and life that wasn't just defined by its pain, was completely sort of mind-blowing. And so I do have hope, because I feel like you're seeing more and more and more of those stories, but it feels sometimes like the white minorities have to do it first in order for everybody else to kind of do it. And I don't feel like, and I do believe that, you know, it isn't a coincidence that you saw Irish writers moving into that space first, and now you're seeing everything else moving through, because generally that sort of kind of tends to be a bit of an indicator. It's one of my frustrations, because I do think publishing is a meritocracy in lots of ways. I think a good book will thrive. But I do worry that we're missing out on, or have missed out on, some fantastic stories and tales and brilliant authors, because we just won't allow them to be their best authentic selves, where they can only be a mirror of what we perceive they should be, which is very sort of media oriented, you know.
I want to sort of bring all of you in really at this point, but addressing the whole issue around literary agents as gatekeepers and holding a problematic role. And the fact that in the UK anyway, and from the few pieces of research that have been done showing that if you're not agented and you're a writer of colour, you know, the proportionality compared to your white peers of getting a publishing deal is marked. So I think that, you know, how, you know, coming back to, and also bringing Crystal into this, because Crystal, you're also an agent, about the fact you are in the minority, and at the same time, agents, particularly, you know, the big ones, have a powerful role, and they are seen as gatekeepers. I mean, so where does that position you? Grace, Nell, and I don't know what the situation Grace is in Australia, but yeah, anyone want to respond to that? Crystal?
Yeah, sure. I think, so on the publishing side of Own It, we accept unagented stuff, and actually a lot of what we published has come in that way. So something that came in that way was a book called The 392 by Ashley Hickson Lovins. It was his debut novel. It just came, you know, he'd read a previous book that we published, he'd got in touch, and it was brilliant, and we picked it up. And, you know, I think the need for people to be able to submit without an agent is really important. As a publisher who then has to read through lots and lots of stuff, I do understand the practical kind of restrictions around doing that, because, you know, a lot of stuff gets sent, and that's difficult. But I think because agencies are even more kind of, I think, exclusive and elitist and difficult to penetrate than, say, publishers. Like when I first started in the industry, it was really an agent that I wanted to be. So it's funny, I've kind of come round full circle and getting into publishing because that just felt like the doors were slightly more open. It was slightly more possible. So I think it's really difficult to get an agent. It's really difficult for certain people to get agents who understand them both creatively, but then also can fight for them kind of commercially. And I think as a result, you know, because you do need an agent largely to get a deal or work with the bigger publishers, there is a problem with the ecosystem, and there is a problem with the channels with which talent can come through. And I think as an agent in this space and understanding that, it's kind of, there is a huge responsibility. And, you know, one thing that we don't like to do is just take on too many clients. Like, we like to make sure that every client that we have, we do justice to, we really have time to commit to them. So as a result, you end up saying no to a lot of hugely talented people who should have agents, but you're just not in a position to take everyone on. And, you know, there are a few of us, but unfortunately, the supply of agents who understand and care about certain voices compared to the talent isn't quite where it needs to be yet. So yeah, we are missing out on a lot of voices, and it is very difficult, I find personally, being an agent in this position and the responsibility that comes with it. And, you know, every time I sell something to a publisher, there is that kind of need for that to do well, so that the next time I come to the publisher with something else that feels a bit experimental, feels a bit risky in their minds, is given a chance. So I think there's a lot of responsibility that goes with being an agent generally, but specifically when you're an agent and you're responsible for voices that have traditionally been marginalized, traditionally get the short end of the straw within the industry, whilst also being able to bring through new talent. It's kind of, a lot to tread very carefully. But having said that, I also find it a real privilege. I think for me, it's about finding the best thinkers, the best writers, the best storytellers, you know, of this generation, and to create the literary canon in this world, but also globally, you know, and that's like a huge privilege. And it's, yes, it's a responsibility, and yes, it's a challenge, but actually there's so much hope that lies within that kind of challenge. So yeah, it can be a double-edged sword, but I think ultimately it's just a real privilege.
Grace, do you feel the same?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I mean, I find it really frustrating because there are a very, very small number of agents that do come from any sort of diverse background in this country, because the nature of being an agent, I think, is, you know, it's really hard to build a list. It's really hard to make money at it. It's really hard to then start an agency and then actually have some, you know, financials behind it. So, you know, how do people do it unless they're independently wealthy a lot of the time? I was very lucky in my situation that I was able to take my list with me. It requires, as we all know, a lot of nurturing, a lot of developing, and also I think, and I guess this is the bit that's really sucks, is when you're a person of color, First Nations, coming from a diverse background, there is so much anxiety around whether you belong in this space and at what point we can own it. And I think now what you were saying before about, you know, in those acquisitions meetings, and I feel exactly the same way. I feel like there were so many books that I could have placed, you know, when I started out, that just never saw the light of day because of this and because of that sort of understanding, or that thinking, not understanding because it's not true, that no one wants to read these voices that people from these backgrounds don't read. And they cannot, and I say they, but the predominantly white publishing industry cannot take themselves out of that and see this other perspective or vantage point, yet we have to spend our entire lives doing that for them. And just that constant disconnect and pushing up against it, you know, it's frustrating. It's frustrating. And I don't, you know, I'm hoping the publishing industry as a whole is so sort of elusive, you know. It's such a hard one for people to understand, particularly agenting. And I really hope that, I mean, feeling like it's a welcome place to kind of be in. I think that's what Gabby and I really wanted to do at Left Bank, was actually really create a community where, like, our writers speak to each other. They feel like they're part of something. They feel like they're part of that collective, and that they kind of have a home in this space, because it does feel so at arm's length so much of the time. And so, you know, like, what happens in those rooms? What happens in those acquisitions meetings? What happens when our books are taken, and where they go, and how that they come out sort of a sausage mill at the other end. And I think particularly diverse writers feel suddenly like their book wasn't actually understood or seen for what they wrote it for, because of that problem with, you know, the lack of diversity in the industry as well.
Thanks, Grace. Now you're nodding at different points with Grace and Crystal's answers. I mean, you're with an agency, and, you know, and you say that you get involved with writers whose work, you said about being a privilege, that make your heart sing. At the same, and then you have to sort of then negotiate with publishers. I mean, you know, what would you want to sort of pick up on in relation to that whole idea about the role of agents, the privilege, but also the, you know, the gatekeeping role, and you being in a minority in terms of agents of colour?
I think there were definitely more agents of colour than there used to be. Like, there are a lot more, which is which is really kind of good to see, and very, very kind of necessary. And I think also people from like just much more varied backgrounds, like from working class background. You know, I used to joke that when I first arrived in publishing, it was for white middle class Emmas. Everyone was called Emma. They were usually white and blonde, and they usually came from a middle class background. Whereas I think it's definitely a lot more kind of disparate, and you know, a wider spread of sexuality and gender identification, which is definitely needed. In terms of kind of gatekeepers and being kind of and the privilege of that, I think that's a really difficult one, because I think essentially being an agent is to have a kind of form of arrogance without being arrogant yourself. It's sort of, which is a line I kind of have to tread quite a lot. I was just basically thinking, I know better than anyone else, and I see this, and this is great, and you're wrong, and you need to see what I'm seeing. And I think that it's really hard, because when I was at the beginning of my career, I had more space to be, I think, a bit more of a pioneer and a bit more of a rebel, because I didn't have tons and tons of clients, so I could afford to take more risks. I could afford to take on things that may not have an easy commercial space or slot that you could pop into, but which was like, this really deserves to be published, and this is a really talented writer, and I'm going to give them a lot of time and effort and energy to getting them on their way. And you see the return of authors like that, like Bernardine Evaristo, who I criminally only discovered with Girl, Woman, Other, and then I was like, God, there's a whole backlist. What? And actually, one of my favorite books of hers is Mr. Loveman, which came out ages ago, and I loved that book, and I finished it, and I was like, how was this not huge? This is amazing. And of course it's getting its moment in the sun now, but you know, it took her such a long time to kind of get there. And you think, thank God she had an agent and a publisher who just kept with them. The issue, I think, is kind of Grace says, and Crystal has said, which is one of the things I was nodding on, is that now I'm at a certain stage where I just can't do that in the same space that I used to. And I think that's the grief that I have, is that I can spot things that 8 years ago would say, you've got time, you can do this, go for it. But me now is like, I can't. I genuinely don't think that I have the time and the energy and the space to be able to dedicate to this, because I have 30 publications across different formats and different territories this year, and I'm constantly running behind. I'm already behind in some of my edits. I mean, after this, I'm literally going to be taking myself off for the day and not responding to emails, which is going to make me feel a bit sick, because I am so behind in edit. Like yesterday, it was my son's birthday. He went off for a swimming class. I spent 45 minutes of my time that I would usually be doing to like do the laundry and clean up and, you know, put some balloons on an edit. And I only managed to get through about 8 pages. That's the kind of thing that I worry about. And I think that's my grief, because there aren't enough. There's more, but there's not enough. And so where is that tranche going to go into? And I don't think it's just that people from our background are the only ones who can see it. I don't think that at all, in the same way that, you know, I represent people from a whole variety of spaces and backgrounds, and that are completely different from me. I think it's just, are we brave enough or open-minded enough as an industry to want to take on something that challenges our worldview? And whether or not that is ubiquitous beyond this section is more in doubt, I think. And I think the reason I say this is because when you grow up as a person of colour in a situation, in a culture where you are the minority, you do develop a hypervigilance. You do look outside of yourself and think, okay, how does this person act, and how do I adopt that mannerism, or how do I acclimate and assimilate myself to that? If you've grown up in a majority, you've not needed to do that. So I think by nature, we are constantly forced to be open-minded and wider in terms of our thinking and landscape, because we've had a very panoramic view from the get-go. If you've never had to do that, do you naturally have an inclination to want to expand that horizon, and in what way? And I think that's the question, that's the concern. And I don't know. I hope so. I really do. I really, really, really do. I do feel better about the fact that I think the next generation will be. I do. I see it like kind of all the time. I sometimes think that like actually what we need to do is just wait for people in their like late teens and 20s to kind of come up and start really kind of shifting stuff, because I feel like that's where the pioneer is kind of happening. I feel like there's a real bravery and ambition and sort of lack of kind of some of the weird things that we've kind of had from kind of growing up in the late 80s and 90s and stuff, that they don't, and they're much more able to challenge authorities in a way that I never would have at the age of 23 to 26, never. And I see it now and I'm like, do you know what, good for you, actually, like, well done, good for you for standing up and saying, I don't think that's cool, I don't think that's fair, I think this book is kind of stereotypical, I think there's a lot of kind of prejudice. Fair enough, good for you on doing that, because I don't think there's nearly enough of that, actually.
I was going to say, I was on the picket line on my first journalism job when I was in my mid-20s, and my mum goes, oh, you are so unemployable. And here I am. So I think that you know, that this is something that every generation we have. I think the fact that we have you know, the Black Lives Matters protests, you know, and the fact that there was a shift from them being seen as, you know, almost like borderline terrorist group to now being, you know, seen as something that we all have to take account of, you know, and George Floyd's murder. I think that and social media, and even being the COVID pandemic, what that's empowered people. And also intergenerational conversations, because I want to bring you in, Rachel, because a lot of what you're dealing with is generational. I mean, how for you as a publisher, and particularly, you know, the acknowledgement where, you know, as a result, inevitably representing minority groups across the intersections means that you invariably become a trauma publisher, you know, and then when you think about this, the situation that your writers face with agents, I mean, if you can shed some light on what that reality is like for your writers, in terms of what you've heard and what some has come to light regarding being agented or not.
Oh, look, you know, in terms of Australia and in terms of, you know, Black authors being represented by agents, usually in the past, cold day in hell. Very rare, very unusual, you know, because in Australia, as you know, in the 80s and even earlier, as with the rest of the world, anything that is the other was always too hard, and majority society just didn't want to feel guilty about, you know, what, you know, it's too hard, we don't want to feel guilty, I'm not interested, all, you know, all of that stuff. So, and being at an Aboriginal publishing house, and going through hoops in a sense that getting books onto shelves, so getting a black book onto a shelf, you know, you have to educate the bookseller to not put it on the bottom shelf in the Australiana section, like it is albino kangaroo, when in actual fact you could put it in the fiction section, or a children's book in the children's book section. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's so, you know, not only are you publishing people from a minority group, but you're also trying to educate the industry about the basic stuff that they do not know where to put stuff, you know, like for us, the stuff that I read, the stuff that I publish, you know, these are all universal stories. They all have connection. They're great. But, you know, the majority of people say, oh, it's too hard, you know, people won't understand that. And it's like, you know, I think publishers and publishing houses forget that their readers are intelligent people that can discern for themselves the message or the characters or whatever it is that is being written within the book, irrespective of who the writer is, you know, where they come from, what their colour is, what their gender, what their religion, because ultimately it is about connection, you know, and we all have a human experience in that regard. So let's say in the last 5 years, I've had now probably about 3 agents, you know, come to Magabala to pitch stuff to us. And I don't know about you, but like we've just sat there and I've just gone and looked like, you know, like what the hell is happening here? Why are they here? Who are these people? What the hell does this agent want with us? Because don't they know we're Black? You know, like what are you doing? So it's kind of like been really interesting to see First Nations, people of colour and minority groups now have agents, you know, and that the industry in a sense is willing to step up in some way, even though it doesn't know how. Do you know what I mean? Like we've got cadetships happening in the industry. You know, we want to get this rolling. We want to do this. And it's kind of, we want all these editors. We want all these people of colour to be editors. And as far as I'm concerned, you know, if you're Black and you're being employed as an editor, you're just another domestic, you know, and I come from a long line of Black domestics in that regard. So for me, it's about making space for, you know, marketing managers, agents, the next publishers, you know, rights people in this space, you know, people that have the agency to be able to say yes or no and affect change, you know, in lots of different ways, not just on a page, you know, in that regard. So that's ultimately, you know, about what we want to do. And, you know, and Australia also doesn't necessarily have the population as the English, the UK and the US in regards to having agents, but to be able to make your way through rather quickly what comes before you, a trusted agent is always very good, you know, without a doubt.
Thank you. I mean, last point now, because we've got around 8 minutes left. So I want to move on to, it's not less about what you want to see in the industry and change. I want to sort of shine a light on what you're actually doing, because to make things more inclusive, more holistic, and more beneficial to the writers, and you know, and invariably setting up different standards for the industry. I mean, your business model, Crystal, you know, about having the 50-50 split with the artists and authors, they publish, you know, you publish. Rachel, you know, you're, you know, focused on protecting intellectual property and copyright, and you invest in writers, and you're a member of the Small Press Network. I mean, those sort of things are so on top of everything that you're doing. You know, that you are making sure that you know that equity isn't just a performative endeavor. So I just want to get a sense of flavour briefly of the different things that you're doing or investing in or committed to within your own practice and your own agencies. That's you feel is making, you know, is an investment of a kind. Nell?
Well, I mean, sorry, the reason that I'm doing this, hesitating, is because I'm just slightly concerned about something. Look, I'm obviously going to be representing things that I think are brilliant, regardless of where they came from. Nothing about that has changed whatsoever, and it never will. And I am very interested in stories that challenge me, that transport me, and that ultimately I think are bringing something to the world and to the canon that I think is really important and significant. I, you know, sit on boards. I run sort of schemes and initiatives like prizes for people of colour, very specifically. What I think I should be doing more is, or what I want to do more, figure out a way to do more, is speaking up for people that I feel are being unfairly targeted and bullied, and doing that in a way that is helpful and truthful. And I think the reason that I say this is because I'm still trying to figure out a way to navigate that. What I've noticed increasingly in the industry at the moment is that when people put out certain books or stories or ideas about people of colour or people from different backgrounds, and then people from that background say, I found this offensive, or I found this difficult, or I found this traumatic, or this was wrong, they are victimised. they are stigmatized. They are shouted and screamed down and told that they are censoring people and that they have misunderstood stuff. And there's a real kind of arrogance to that, which is that, you know, if that person who lives that truth tells you you've got that perspective wrong, listen. You don't have to absorb all of it, but at least take the time and consideration and respect to listen and absorb that intel and think about it. And what I seem to notice is that those people who try to speak up and think about speaking up, the long-term damage for them is so much more significant than the person who did it. And as an industry, we stay silent because you don't want to pour more fuel on the fire. But sometimes and more recently, I started to think, is that cowardice more or you know, silent complicity or not? And I think it's really difficult trying to figure out how to navigate and help that. And that's what I want to do more of and figure out a way to do myself, because it's really painful to watch it fold out. And a lot of it happens on social media where you can't have a nuanced discourse, and it's very difficult, but it's something I think we're really failing people at. And so that's what I want to do better. I'm still trying to figure out how to do that.
Thanks, Nell. And the thing is that, you know, what you're thinking about is something as an individual, is something that needs to be part of the collective. You know, so we're not figuring out these things on our own, you know, and that all the onus is on you. But Grace, I'll come to you. Thank you, Nell.
No, I was just going to say, Nell, you know, I just feel like there's such a defensiveness. There's just such, like, people won't listen. And it's just like, it just is so divided. And I just, you know, and I think, yeah, am I just being this, you know, eternal optimist that, you know, we can get back to a place of conversation and actually start, because we have come a long way, yet it just, during this period, it just feels so like these walls against each other are just, I don't know. It's like, I feel like we've, you know, come so far and then so far backwards in how we have been processing it and how we think we need to be and how we just have to pick a side and that's it. There's no room for the nuance. There's no room for that conversation space. But, you know, answering your question, I think one of the things I did last year and something that I was talking about for so long, well, not last year, I can't even remember what year it was, but yeah, no, it was last year, was when the sort of pandemic started and I just lost a will to read. I just couldn't do it. I just really found it hard. I wasn't trusting my instincts. I wasn't trusting my arrogance, because it's true. You have to have that. And that I really lost a sense of that. And so I put a lot of energy into something that I've been talking about for years, which was trying to get an internship up and running that was for people from diverse backgrounds, First Nations, people of colour, that was not based on what your academic status was. You didn't have to have a degree. You didn't have to finish high school. You just had to be 18 plus with no age limit, just because of, you know, safety and laws and things like that. But that this was a program that was based on people's passion and love for books and for writing. And that there's so many, you know, you talk about the gatekeepers. I mean, you know, who can take a job at a publishing house earning, you know, $30,000 a year or whatever it is and survive in some of the major cities? I mean, it's impossible. And that, let alone do free unpaid internships, you know, which is just ludicrous. So if we're going to make any of that change, it needs to start sort of coming through. And we also need to put, as an industry, I think, need to put our money where our mouth is. You know, I think, again, it's not a charity. It's not something we feel like we need to do. It's something that we have to do because it's changing and we are changing. And as a nation, this country, you know, we have so far to go. It's terrifying and daunting, but yeah, I mean, I guess that's what I've been working on. Who knew it would have taken so much time? But, you know, it's exciting because we're about to announce our first 2 interns. But, you know, it's this thing where, yeah, it's, I don't know. I just felt like I had to do something, but we'll see.
Thanks, Grace. Crystal, and then Rachel.
Yeah, I mean, so like you mentioned, on the publishing side of the business, we have a 50-50 net profit split. I worked in contracts for about 3 or 4 years when I was at Penguin Random House, and it felt quite exploitative. It feels generally speaking that the publishing industry is, whether, you know, you work and you're working all the hours and only getting paid a certain salary, or whether you're an author and, you know, it just, so, and something that kind of struck me was the model of, you know, 4 installments of the advance paid normally over like 2-3 years. And, you know, for debut authors, for up and coming writers, especially those who are already up against it because of various reasons, that model doesn't always work. So in terms of introducing new business models and having different options and things, I think that's really important. That's something we've done from our inception. But honestly, sometimes I think it's the smaller things, not the big tangible schemes and stuff. But for me, it's kind of like, honestly, just being my authentic self. I think it's a blessing and a curse in some ways, but I've always done that. So when I came into the industry, I didn't shave off parts of myself or polish parts of myself. I presented as I am, I speak as I do. And that's very far from kind of traditional publishing. And I think sometimes just being that and being in those spaces can make so much more difference than the things that you think you're doing make a difference. Because it just, I was on BBC Radio 4 one time and I was speaking, and there was a tweet after saying, why do I have this Cockney 3-year-old sounding person on my radio, but actually she's quite literary. And I retweeted that, and I love that, because it's like, okay, you have this perception from my voice, but now I can see your brain ticking, because you're like, she's actually quite literary. She's actually, so I think sometimes just changing perceptions by being you is some of the most powerful things you can do. And I think one of the things that I'm very proud of in terms of Own It is it's Black and Brown owned. This is founded by myself, British Indian, my partner Jason Morgan, who's British Jamaican, both very working class, both present very working class, but just not only being in roles where we're agents and publishers, but we're owners of that business and we're the decision makers and we are CEOs. I think that in itself is also very, very important. And it's partly why we have the 50-50 business model. Is a lot of it for us is about ownership of IP, of our own content, of our own, and even as authors and artists and, you know, content creators, like having a 50-50 collaboration where actually you're not just taking a 10% royalty on a small advance, it's a partnership in that way. I think those things sometimes are very powerful, and you know, they're hard because it's a sacrifice. Like presenting as your authentic self ultimately means you do miss out, you do lose out, you are judged, you constantly have that feeling of loneliness because you're in this environment where you stick out and you don't try to fit in. But I do think, you know, like I said, blessings and curse, but I think sometimes those are powerful ways to change minds and culture and environments as much as kind of some of the other things that are happening, which are also important.
Thanks, Crystal. And also changing yourself, because I think, you know, a lot of the time you grow because it's what you're being made back through your company and through your writers and their development. Yes, it does feel lonely because in terms of the responsibility, isn't it? You know, I can relate to what you're saying a lot. And at the same time, I think we've got to remind ourselves, isn't it, that look at who you are now. You are evolving, you know, which is not necessarily happening within the industry. Thanks. And Rachel, ending on you with the question.
Okay. Look, at Magabala Books, we, try to put our money where our mouth is, in a sense, and recently employed 3 cadets, Aboriginal cadets. I'm hoping to replace myself, and I'm hoping to at once, in the future, leave my position. Because in publishing, we all know the only reason you can move up is when somebody dies. So I'm hoping to do that before, before that happens. At Magabala, we've, recently done a Daisy Udamara Junior Fiction YA Award as well, because we do know that the literary sphere is very class orientated, and it's also has a lot of snob value. And, and this is about removing the snobbiness in and around what people of colour, people from diverse backgrounds read, and it takes different strokes for different folks to read different things, to appeal to them at different times of their life, to make a difference. And we cannot be at all snobby or sitting on our pedestals about what we can and cannot publish. We've also done a Kestin Indigenous Illustrators Award, where, we pay an illustrator up to $10,000, $15,000, for a first-time illustrator to be able to publish their first title. And, because anybody who comes from these backgrounds know that the only way you can make a difference in it is by time, and the only way you get time is by getting money. So this is about carving out space and time for individuals that don't get space and time, where, meditating, majority of people can't do those type of things because of the lifestyles they lead, So this is about carving out time for individuals' craft to be able to have a step up so that they are on par with their peers in an industry that they don't see themselves in, So, we do platforms in and around making sure that individuals, authors, illustrators have agency in terms of moving forward. Even if it is for us to have a first-time author that then moves on to a larger publishing company, we also measure that as a success. In terms of where I work inside the publishing, it's also about decolonising the space. So for us, it's about strengths based on the creator that sits in front of us, and if they don't necessarily know where they sit, we look to their strengths with how they talk, where they come from, the genre that they're comfortable in. They don't need to be literate to be able to write. They just need a good story. And how do we make that happen in the best way possible for them, that suits not only them, but their community? Because as you know, a Black person or a person of colour or someone from a minority group does not exist in a vacuum. They are obligated to their community. And in publishing, publishing industry is only obligated to the individual. So we also have a moral obligation to the larger community that we're pulling individuals out of to make sure that whatever they're writing doesn't alienate them any further, not only from the majority of, the industry and the public, but also really to their community and to their home, So, there's all of that stuff. We do scholarships where sometimes we just give people money to go and do whatever they want to do, for the sake of doing whatever they need to do to nourish their souls, to create in however they want to create. We don't judge that. They come and tell us how they want to do it. And, and if it's money for Uber Eats for an entire week while they, can write and they don't have to cook, by all, let's do that. Like whatever suits the individual at any stage of their life, that's what we do. And in terms of publishing, we do publish to deadlines, but in terms of the individual in front of us and their life story and where they come from in their community, it is about their journey and whether they're comfortable to be able to let go of their story. So we've had individuals who have wanted to tell a story they've written. We've gone all the way to the publishing stage. The books have been delivered to the warehouse, and the individuals still have not been able to let go for whatever trauma or wounding in their life. So we've pulped it, and I've said generously, I've reverted your rights back to you. Let's have a conversation in a year, or let's have a conversation in 2 years, and we can revisit where you're at in a space that's safe for you. Do you know what I mean? So, and as an Aboriginal publisher at an Aboriginal publishing house, it is about deep listening. You know, we have forgotten that art. You know, I've been telling the same shit to people for 30 years. They don't listen. They only want to hear what they want to hear. And those people that don't listen, who also have their own agendas, for me personally, it's a mental illness. You know, you can't reason with individuals that for whatever reason will not listen to you, or will not listen to the truth in, you know, the person who's much more experienced in that way. And also at Magabala Books, what we try to do, you know, with educational publishing and stuff like that as well, is we preference the oral historical and the lived experience of the person in front of us, without them having to write defensively to prove or write themselves into history. So.
Thank you so much, Rachel. Thank you all, Grace, Nell, Crystal and Rachel, for such a rich conversation. And I just dare anyone who sees this conversation recorded not to listen. All right, all the best, and thank you again.
No worries, thank you.
All right.
Thanks.